again to another episode of Tactical Enlightenment. These YouTube channels dedicated to helping you get better at Bannerlord through the use of field command and advanced tactics. And we are going to take a step back and we are going to start to look at some of the components of an army that will lead you into success in battle. And this is going to be part of a larger series in which we are going to cover the different types of troops that are within Bannerlord, some of my general philosophies on them, and then some of the strategies that you can use in your own game to maximize the effectiveness of these type of units. So this episode we're going to cover infantry in great detail. In this episode we're going to be covering particularly the types of infantry and then some of their strengths and weaknesses. Now, the Battanians are an absolutely perfect example of different types of infantry, and I mean that from the perspective of they have in their three different troop lines here, they have what I would consider the three major types of infantry. I'll get into that a little bit more. There's different types beyond these three, but these are sort of the main three that I consider sort of the staple of most armies. Now, not everybody has these three types. For example, Khazate really only has the one type, right? They have a shield, spear, and sword warrior in the Dark Hands, and that's because they rely on horse archers. But most army types have either these three or a close approximation to these three types. So the three different types, basically, the first one is your sort of standard infantryman who has a spear, a shield, and a sword. This is very standard. This is sort of ancient history standard. They have a spear to help them against heavy cavalry, and of course they have a shield and a sword, both to fight and then a shield to protect themselves against arrows. This is very standard infantry, and I'm just going to refer to them frequently as a spear and shield infantry in this episode. The next type is one that's not as well understood, but it's what's called a shock troop. Shock troops effectively are your two-handed weapon guys, your barbarians, your berserker types. This guy's a perfect example. He doesn't even have fucking sleeves. I guess he thinks he's fucking badass. That's not the greatest idea, by the way, but I digress. So he doesn't have a shield at all. As you can see, his weapon loadout is just a falx. Now, you have potentially 4 different weapon slots for your units, so this actually doesn't make a lot of sense. He has room for some throwing axes or whatever, but this is how Tailworlds has set it up. And the shock troops generally have a giant two-handed weapon, a two-handed polearm, a giant axe, or in that guy's case, he has a very fast sword. This is one of the fastest swords you'll find on any unit, and this defines the shock troop, right? They're basically, they're not necessarily lower armored. This guy actually has some decent armor, and the top-tier Battanian troop, this veteran Falksman, has pretty strong armor. But what defines these guys is they don't have defense. They don't have a shield. This guy actually does have a few puny throwing axes. And I'll talk about throwing weapons at a later point as well. But that's basically what you need to understand. Shock troops, that is your Sturgian line breakers, right? These guys also, again, no shield. For some reason or other, this guy has a one-handed weapon. He might as well drop that off at the local Salvation Army because that's worthless when you have a giant two-handed axe, especially, again, because he has no shield. So again, not to beat a dead horse, but your shock troops have two-handed weapons generally and no shield. The third type, and this is a pretty common type, and this happens to be my favorite type for strategies, for tactics and Bannerlord, and that is your skirmisher, right? The Battanian unit actually is called a skirmisher. The wildlings in particular, this is one of my favorite infantrymen, which brings up another point. There's all kinds of guides out there that say which type of infantry is best. This is the best type of infantry. What is your favorite? What are garbage infantry? I don't really believe there's a reality behind that. Now, it is true that there are some types of infantry that are generally weaker in Bannerlord. The spear and shield guys tend to be fairly weak, and that's partly because the damage that they cause with their spear is really low. The game mechanics in Bannerlord definitely it's essentially negative for these guys with a shield and a spear. Of course, this is the foundation of armies for hundreds of years, so it's kind of unfortunate that Bannerlord doesn't represent that very well, but you're going to have to add mods or wait for Tailworlds to change things before spear infantry is really something that's predominantly powerful in the game. I prefer shock troops, but my number one preference, again, if I could only have one type of infantry, would be skirmishers, especially the Battanian wildlings, and that's because they have 10 javelins that they can throw. Now, real quickly, the difference between javelins and throwing axes is pronounced. Not only can you carry more javelins, for some reason, I guess, even though the javelins are larger and heavier, you can only carry 3 or 4 axes. Meanwhile, this guy with javelins, he has 2 bags of 5. But they act very differently in battle. Throwing axes, it seems like they have a shorter range, they're less accurate, and it doesn't seem like they do anywhere near the same damage as a javelin. Now, of course, that would probably be true. If you got hit by a gigantic javelin thrown by a world-class athlete, you would be killed, right? It would just go right through you like the strongest spear thrust you've ever imagined, and that would be that. I digress again. I'm getting off the subject here. The bottom line is, though, I love skirmishers, but I don't truly think there is a best type of infantry. Now, individually, if you pit the infantry against each other like in a custom battle, there have been some guys out there on YouTube that have done this. There are some types of infantry that do better against each other, but I don't think that's a very accurate test, right? Because when's the last battle you fought where you had 500 falksmen and the enemy had 500 skirmishers, right? This is not how battle works. Battle is always a combination and a chaotic mix of different units, and I really do think that all of these types of infantry have their value. They have their purpose. They have their rock, paper, scissors moment where they are the scissors and the enemy is the paper. Now, sometimes they are the scissors and the enemy is the rock and they get smashed, and I will talk about those dynamics a little bit in this episode and the episodes to follow. So skirmishers, again, the big difference between these other two types is that they always will have throwing weapons. Now, there are skirmishers that have throwing axes. To me, that's not a skirmisher, again, because the throwing axe is so weak. When I look for skirmishers, I want guys that have javelins. The lake rats, for example, have a very powerful top-tier infantry, kind of similar, in fact, to the wildling, and they have 2 stacks of 5 javelins. If I'm picking out minor noble clans that I want to recruit from, the lake rat is always amongst my top. Now, strangely, the tier 2 lake rats, the tier 1, you know what? This has changed. The last time I looked, some of the lower level lake rats had throwing axes, so that's kind of an interesting change. It looks like now they all have harpoons, which is a good upgrade. In the past, they actually had throwing axes. Harpoons are far superior. Like I said before, I don't want to beat a dead horse. And again, they have a shield and a sword. So it's not that skirmishers are worthless in battle besides their throwing weapons. In fact, they're very capable. It's just that they're not as capable and they're not as diverse. Of course, they don't have a spear, and so theoretically they're more vulnerable to things like cavalry, and they don't have a two-handed weapon. As far as I know, there are no two-handed weapon guys that have javelins in the whole game, other than your own companions and characters that you can make. Incidentally, I would choose that troop as my favorite type of troop if that existed. Now, I know the Sturgian line breaker, the heavy line breakers, I know they have throwing axes, but they only have 3 of them, and for some reason, again, these dipshits carry a one-handed sword. Again, I guess that's so that they can look cool on the battlefield instead of, a practical loadout. If these guys had 2 javelins, then unquestionably these guys would be my favorite, or even 3 javelins, then unquestionably this would be my favorite type of infantry, but alas, they don't. Now, the Sturgians kind of have all 3 lines, like I was talking about before. They have the classic spear, sword, and shield infantry, and incidentally, all of the infantry are a little bit different. When you compare this guy to the Oathsworn, right, there's minute differences, everything down to armor, everything down to stats are very slightly different. You can see this guy's got 130 athletics, 130 one-hand, 130 pole arm. If you go to the line, the heavy spearmen, those stats are basically altered slightly. The one hand is higher, the pole arm is higher, but the athletics are slightly lower. But the armor loadouts vary considerably. And this guy here, the Sturgian Heavy Spearman, has absolutely some of the best armor out of all the infantry in the game. And this is why this is my preference for a spear warrior. Now, it doesn't mean that the Oathsworn are worthless troops, right? These guys are still fairly capable in battle, but they just don't have quite the durability of the Sturgian Heavy Spearman, right? I'm not actually going to get into enormous detail as to whether or not I like the Sturgian Spearman or the Oathsworn Spearman. I think they all have their value. What I'm here to talk about is more of how to use these guys, right? The first we talk about the different types, right? There's the shock troops, there are the skirmishers, and there are the spear warriors, and then it's basically then how to use them. Now, there are other types of infantry, and they're kind of obscure. There's this guy right here. For some reason, this macho guy, he has a spear, he has a very nice pike, and he has no shield, right? So that means this guy is incredibly vulnerable to archers. But in theory, he mauls cavalry. This guy's basically just looking to spit heavy horse on his two-handed polearm. And again, for hand-to-hand combat, he's got a little sword. That's not totally worthless. But again, for some reason, this tough guy doesn't want to carry a shield on his back. Maybe he's lazy or something like that. And so that's basically a very unique individual. There aren't a lot of units like this in the game. There's the hired elite pike. This is a mercenary that you can pick up at towns. They got to be upgraded from this infantry tranche. And again, I don't find these guys to be tremendously valuable, and part of the reason is that it doesn't really work like a full Schiltron did back in medieval warfare, right? The Scots used the Schiltron to great effect. The Schiltron basically is where you have either a circle or a square of outward-facing pikes, and they would be densely packed. In fact, there'd be a guy literally right over your shoulder if you were the guy at the front, and all of these long spears, 10, 15, even upwards of 20 feet long, would be highly difficult for cavalry to penetrate, right? If you could even get a heavy horse to charge it, of course they would get skewered, they would get poked in the face, the rider might get dismounted, etc. Now these guys are capable of spear bracing on the ground, and that's probably the best way to use these guys. I know how to do that as my own infantry, but these guys generally, to me, they don't perform very well in combat, and so I tend to avoid these type of units. Now, it could be that I'm just ignorant to them. I have not played a Valandian campaign to the very end. Maybe somebody out there has discovered a very dynamic way to use these guys. I know there is the pike, what is it called? The pike and shot strategy, where you have these guys intermixed with crossbow, and I have played around with that a little bit in custom battles and other avenues, but I just haven't found it to be anywhere near as successful as the other strategies that I employ. Hence, I'm not going to get deep into the weeds on the pikemen. As you can see, the Valandians, they have the standard sort of spear and shield infantry. Then they have this odd pike guy, which quite honestly, I just don't think they're very useful in Bannerlord. And then again, they have their Volgier. The Volgier, this French word, forgive me if I'm butchering that. This, again, is their guy that's out there wailing away with this giant fucking executioner looking thing, causing great damage. And again, just like the Sturgian version, he has a few throwing axes, I guess, just so that he can do something at range and not be totally worthless. He's almost worthless as range because, like I said, the throwing axes are garbage, but he's not totally worthless at range. All right, so those are basically the three types. Plus, you have this pike type, which is also kind of you can call that a fourth type. Most most kingdoms don't have that, right? The Sturgian linebreaker and the Sturgians, they don't have a guy who just has a pike. Their guy who has a pike is smart enough to carry a shield and a sword, so he's multi-purpose. The pike unit is a unique type, but I really don't find it to be very valuable. The final type of infantry is what's called garbage. And when you're upgrading your infantry, you're going to have these units. They have strictly a shield and strictly a sword. And until they're upgraded, until they eventually get themselves a spear, you have this very low-level infantry, which is basically it's worthless from the tactics and strategy micro level. You can't really tell this guy to do anything fancy other than like a shield wall, right? He's incapable of really flanking and hitting the weapon or hitting the enemy with throwing weapons. He doesn't have any ability to form like a big pike wall and fend off cavalry. So this lower level troop, really early in the game in Bannerlord, you don't have a lot of tactics. A lot of people are very eager to see me play a campaign from the beginning and sort of see what I can do with low level tactics. Well, until you get to this tier 3 troop, until you start adding some spears, until you start adding some harpoons and throwing weapons, there really isn't a whole lot of tactics to Bannerlord. Now, fortunately, some tier 1 troops, only tier 2 troops, some of them do actually have javelins, but again, this guy has no shield. I guess he's not strong enough to carry a shield as well as a sword, for whatever reason, though. Most of the tier 2 level troops are relatively worthless. arrows from the stage and scope of tactics. So we are going to focus on the tier 3 and tier 4 troops, and especially the tier 5, because that's where your troops are fully fleshed out. They start to look badass. And you can really start doing tactics with these guys because they have great survivability. Not only do they have great armor, but a lot of these guys have strong athletics, and they have good weapon skills, right? So this guy knows what he's doing out there. He's got good protection. He can fend off cav pretty well with his spear, and of course he's no slouch in hand-to-hand combat with a strong sword and a nice big shield. The shield size matters. I find that Sturgian units have the largest shields, or at least the most optimally designed shields, and when they're in a shield wall, Sturgians to me have by far the best defensive posture and the greatest survivability against enemy attacks, be it archers or infantry or even cavalry. Sturgian infantry to me is the overall superior unit when it comes to Bannerlord. That said, I really like the skirmishers and the troops that are part of Britannia. Britannia, of course, is sort of famed for their Britannian Fian champs, and rightly so, but I find the Britannian line actually pretty darn good, because these guys are tough. The Oathsworn, they're not very offensively strong, right? These guys are fairly limited in their damage. They carry sort of a weak axe and these pathetic throwing axes, but they've got good defense. Most importantly, though, their two-handed weapon guy, if you can get this guy out in the open where he's wailing away with his Romphalia, these guys cause major damage. And then, like I said before, their skirmishers are the best. This guy right here, if I could only choose one infantry for my army, this would be the guy. A lot of people like the legionary, but unfortunately they don't have any throwing weapons. And the way that I fight, and the way that I think most people should be fighting and using skirmishers, throwing weapons dramatically improves the strength of your army. In fact, I have a whole episode dedicated strictly to skirmishers. I just think it's a highly undeveloped game in most people's strategy. And in this episode and in future episodes, I'm going to continue to talk about skirmishers and effectively how to use them and why they're so underrated, right? Why these guys basically can start to help you dominate the battlefield. I really like their tier 4 guy as well. This guy with the 5 harpoons. These guys are pretty lethal, right? So the next thing I want to talk about is essentially their strengths and weaknesses, right? This is again sort of the rock paper scissor component of it, right? Your standard spear and shield guy, these guys are really good against archers, right? If the enemy's pounding them with arrows, they generally have a nice shield. They can go into a good shield wall, and they can defend pretty well against that. Now, so can the wildling, but this guy's, and we'll get to that as well. But your standard spear and shield infantry is very solid against archers in a defensive standpoint. Now, they don't close very quickly. These guys don't move real fast, but most infantry are kind of slow. They just do quite well against archers. These guys are also pretty good against cavalry. Now, if they're moving, like all troops, if enemy heavy cav is running at you and either you're moving or you're not prepared for them, heavy cav still skewer these guys just like they skewer anybody else. But if you're using these guys correctly, and I'll talk about some formations here in a second, if you're using these guys correctly, they're very strong against cavalry. They're also very solid at making squares. Squares is a good defensive formation that I'll talk about as well. And infantry squares, especially when it's these shield, spear, and sword troops, it's very effective because they're pointing their spears out. You got this prickly hedgehog cactus thing that no cav, cav division wants to charge. And in that square, it also does pretty good against archers, right? So as you can see, I'm a fan of squares with this type of unit, and they're pretty good defensive in that matter. Now these guys move slowly. Generally, their athletics is a little bit lower. You can see the wildlings' athletics is like 140, and they're heavily armored. All these different armors and weapons load them down a little bit, so they tend to move a little closer or a little slower. The other thing that I would say about these guys that's a weakness is damage, right? Your spear guys tend to be lower damage, and that's because they're not swinging a two-handed weapon, right? Anybody knows if you swing a stick at somebody with two hands, you're going to do more damage than swinging it at them with one hand. So that's one of their weaknesses here. And also, I think these guys are quite weak against shock troops. It depends on the scenario, as in all scenarios, but I think if it was a match of strictly shock troops against these shield and spear guys, I think the shock troops would win most of the time. Now, there have been extensive tests done by the guys like the Strat gaming guides that showed the Legionary just whips the shit out of shock troops, right? When they had elite Manavelatons go up against the Legionary I think smoked them most of the time. And again, so there is a little bit of a rock, paper, scissors element to it. But as a rule of thumb, I think these guys are vulnerable to shock troops, especially if the shock troops are used correctly. And we'll get to that as well. All right, so skirmishers. I'm going to cover these guys next. Some of their strengths. These guys generally mangle slow infantry. And what I mean by slow infantry is infantry that's either in a shield wall or moving around the battlefield in a large formation. Skirmishers with their throwing weapons, especially if you can get them on the flanks of heavy infantry, that's basically the bread and butter of what these guys are good at killing at. These guys were sort of originally developed in ancient Rome and that era. And they were designed originally to destroy the very heavily armed infantry, right? These guys would come and take down a large division of and phalanx of hoplites. Hoplites were the sort of shield and spear and sword guys of their day, and they were elite infantry that would run around in a big phalanx. A phalanx is basically a walking schiltron. You can think of it like that, a bunch of guys closely packed with their spears and shields, and it was very difficult for any enemy to attack them. Well, one of their weaknesses was skirmishers. These guys could fly in quickly, hit them from the flank, hit them from different directions. In fact, the very term skirmish, in our minds, it sort of conjures up an image of guys running up, throwing a bunch of weapons, and then as soon as the enemy sort of starts to turn to attack them, these guys scurry away, right? Hence, these guys have more athletics than your standard spear and shield guy. So skirmishers are very powerful against slow and heavy infantry. Skirmishers are also very useful against any shock troops that are not protected, right? These guys are throwing big spears. Shock troops trying to close in battle, they don't have shields, and so if your shock troops are unprotected, they really get skewered and mangled by skirmishers. I also find skirmishers to be useful against cav and archers, but they have to be used correctly, right? One of the big keys against enemy heavy cav is slowing down that heavy cav somehow, either with spears, right? Using some spears to stand their horses up, or squares, or something else, your own cav shield walls to slow down the enemy heavy cav and then skewer them with your javelins, right? That's very much a strategy I'm going to talk about. In fact, after I'm done sort of talking about the strength and weaknesses of these types, we'll have at least one more whole episode talking about sort of the finer details of infantry. We're going to talk about how to use them, how I've found after thousands of hours of playing Bannerlord, how to most effectively use these different types of infantry. Again, I prefer skirmishers, but I think all of them have some value. Now, skirmishers, what are they weak against? Well, they're weak against cav, especially if they're not protected correctly, and that's because they have no spear, right? These guys effectively are they're running around with their shield and some javelins, and if there's a whole bunch of heavy cav, they're going to get trucked. They're going to get knocked to the ground. They're going to get skewered. It's not going to go well for them. They actually do pretty well against archers because, again, they can form a shield wall also. Now, originally, skirmishers really didn't have shields. They were very, very lightly armored. In fact, sometimes they had no armor, and they would just run in with javelins and fire their javelins and then simply run away from the armored enemy, right? The enemy couldn't chase them down. As cavalry became more and more of a force on the battlefield, skirmishers had to become more armored. They had to be more capable of at least standing a chance against heavy cav. And then, of course, with the advent of the dominance of archers in the 14th and 15th century, skirmishers, I don't want to say they went away, but they radically changed how skirmishers are used in battlefields, right? They were used very strategically, and they were much less of a dominant force. Obviously, hundreds of guys with longbows really do a number on lightly armored guys, especially if they didn't have a nice shield, right? So they were strong basically in ancient times and not as strong in the 13th, 14th, 15th century. All that said, in Bannerlord, I think they're very effective, and again, we will show you kind of how I use them and how I think they are optimally used. All right, so strengths and weaknesses for shock troops, right? Shock troops, Obviously, one of their weaknesses is against enemy archers, right? If the archers are at distance from these guys, in other words, if they're 150, 200 distance away, and these guys are unprotected, these guys might as well use their fucking Romphalia to dig their grave, because these guys are going to get killed. They have no shield. These guys are absolutely dead meat to archers. This is a clear rock versus scissors situation for them, and so you must protect them from archers. Again, I'll try to show you some ways to do that, because once these guys are close to archers, it's the other way around, right? Suddenly these guys are the scissors and the archers are the paper, and the archers just get absolutely sliced in half and smashed to bits by their two-handed polearm, right? The line breakers, all these guys, they fucking waiting, and the next thing you know, it's absolute massacre city for archers, right? If you're an archer and this guy's coming after you, it basically is like a horror movie, right? You have this heavily armed guy, you can no longer shoot at him, and his two-handed axe is just cutting your head apart. So that's a weakness, is archers at range, but archers up close, these guys, it really is a binary event. Even at 100 units of the game spacing, and if you don't know about that, the bottom number when you're holding down your tab in battle, that basically shows you the distance from a unit. That's the distance in roughly yards that you are from the enemy. If your shock troops are anything more than like 30 or 40 away from the enemy, you should be changing tactics instead of charging them, because they're going to get shot to pieces and suffer great damage from those archers. Similarly, these guys are vulnerable to skirmishers in that kind of distancing. If they don't have any kind of protection, they are completely fucked in that situation. The last thing, of course, is these guys are vulnerable to cavalry. If you don't have any shield and there's fucking a bunch of heavy horse coming at you like it's a tournament with their 12-foot lance on a horse running 25 miles an hour, you are fucking dead, right? These guys can't really do anything to the horse that's running at them, and so they get mauled by cavalry. So I just told you they're weak to archers, they're weak to skirmishers, and they're weak to cav. What the fuck are these guys good for? Well, what they are is they're critically destructive if you can get them into the optimal position in battle. And we will talk about that in great detail in this episode or in future episodes if I don't have time to cover it here. The basic principle, it's no spoiler, but you protect these guys. You put these guys behind either a wall of heavy cav with shields out in front and plow the road, or you put these guys behind your spear infantry, and once they get close to the enemy, then you unleash hell with these fucking murderers, right? And they do enormous damage. In close range combat, these guys by far are the most destructive units in the game. Again, some of the tests showed like straight legionaries just mangle these guys. That might be the case, but I don't think that's the case across the whole battlefield. I think if you looked at overall battles, especially if they were used correctly against the legionnaires, I think these guys would maul pretty much all of these spear guys, again, if they're used correctly. So that's their main advantage, is getting up to guys, right? If they get up to archers, if they get to cav, that's slowed down, right? If you can stop a cav charge with a guy with a spear, and all of a sudden there's a bunch of slowed down cavs. Think of the movie Braveheart, where they charged the Scots, then they all got stood up by spears. Well, the cavalrymen then got destroyed by two-handed wielding Highlanders who came out with their long swords, or axes in this case, and just absolutely butchered the horsemen, butchered the guys that were on the horse, and William Wallace lived happily ever after, at least until he was drawn and quartered. All right, so the combo guys, that's these guys. You know, I've already covered them. Basically, they're sort of a jack of all trades. They're pretty tough against cav. They have a decent defense layer against archers, right? They can hold up shields. Once they close on archers, of course, they're definitely going to win the majority of their fights with their hand-to-hand sword and shield. And these guys actually do a decent job against shock troops. But again, if there was a battle and you're using your shock troops correctly, these guys should maul 100 or equal sized number of just your standard guys simply through damage output. These guys are going to do massive damage. Some of their weapons are going to actually knock the opponent to the ground, stagger them, etc. The Romphalia, these guys have huge range, right? When you're talking your other types of of infantry that have really long range, right? So the Falksmen, for example, these guys can swing this weapon a long ways away, and if they're maneuvering right, you know, basically keep out of the range of the of the shield and sword infantry, right? If you've ever played a pikeman, that's one of the keys, is to stay at range so you can hit them. You see the weapon length there, I think that's roughly inches. This guy's literally hitting guys 12, 13 feet away with his giant Romphalia. In fact, that's where they do the greatest damage, because that's sort of the sweet spot of their weapon. If they're too close, these guys don't actually do a lot of damage. So let's see. So we covered the combo guys. The spear only guys, the pikes, again, I'm not really even going to cover in great detail because I don't actually think that they're tactically viable. I'm just fine with people coming on and making comments about how they used them, about how they've mastered it, and I'm an idiot. Honestly, that would be just a learning experience for me. But in the handful of dozen battles that I've tried with these guys, I've intentionally recruited a bunch of these guys and then fought some battles specifically try to utilize these pikes. I haven't found it very useful. Now, mixed in with your infantry, which is very common, they probably have some value because these guys do a pretty good job of stopping cav, and in fact that's basically what they're designed to do. But as a rule of thumb, I don't find these guys good enough to be in their own division. Which brings me to another point. When I play Bannerlord, when you play Bannerlord, and when any new player is playing Bannerlord, it probably looks very different. And that's because your typical player, when they're playing Bannerlord, has one infantry division, right? They're going out in the battlefield and they have one group of infantry, right? Bannerlord automatically starts you with the infantry in the first division. I think it's cav in the second, archers in the third, and if you have horse archers, it's in the fourth. This guide is basically going to, this guide and the future guides is basically going to argue against that. I'm basically going to say you are much better off and your army is much more efficient if you separate these guys into different army types and then use those guys tactically for the value and the purpose that they have, right? These different types of weapon loadouts, different types of purposes, different types of rock, paper, scissors, right? If I just told you that certain types do better against certain units, well, you can't use the certain types if all of your infantry is dropped into one big tranche of infantry. So we're going to cover that and more in future episodes. So stay tuned for that. We're gonna cover this in great detail. I have 5 or 6 individual strategies that we're gonna try with infantry. I'm gonna keep reloading this save game. This is from a while ago in my campaign, but it's the perfect opportunity because we have this Aserai force that was near this city, where I was able to dump a bunch of archers into it. I was able to go in and basically make sure, of course I have all my companions, I'll talk about that a little bit, but I was able to make sure that we had a large amount of infantry so that we could fight more traditional infantry battles. I actually had to search for a save game that would work very well for this. You can see the Aserai in this case were sieging. During the siege, it looks like they suffered about 300 and something losses, but look at their army makeup, right? Their army has a lot of infantry and not very many ranged and cavalry. Meanwhile, our force is similar. What that's going to allow me to do here is have a very good testing ground of real battle against a real opponent in Bannerlord. And the Aserai have all 3 of the different types of units as well. The ones that I've just mentioned, they have the spear shield types, they have the skirmishers, although they're not dedicated skirmishers, and then they also have the shock troops and the palace guards. It's going to allow us basically to have some tactical opportunities to show you the different types of uses for infantry, and I've got 5 or 6 different types of actual strategies that will work in Bannerlord that have a historical basis that you can perform in Bannerlord to annihilate your opponent. So stay tuned for that, friends. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode, a little clarity, a little bit more detail into infantry, and we will continue to sort of look at the granular level of the game, right? This is getting deep into the weeds, but there's a lot of players out there that like that shit, right? They want to get deep into the nuts and bolts of a game and understand the little minute details and how to improve their game, because that's how you get better. That's how you start to dominate on the field. If there's ever a multiplayer with Bannerlord, 900 against 1400, I would imagine the people that study deeper like that are going to absolutely lay waste to the people who just have one infantry corps and are sort of using bread and butter tactics. I think once you have these expanded tactics and these specialized combat units, you are just going to simply undress and mangle anybody who doesn't have advanced tactics like that. So let me know what you thought of this episode. Stay tuned, friends. There's going to be more. We're actually going to cover cav and archers as well, an episode similar to this, as we get deep into to the weeds on Bannerlord. So thanks again for watching, friends. Please hit the like and subscribe if you're interested in seeing more. That brings more people to the channel. The more people brought to the channel, of course, that'll give us more all tactical gold. All the kinds of things I've learned from subscribers and people just like you is how I've gotten to the advanced skill level that I am today. So thanks again for watching, friends, and I will see you guys next time.